ambassador program, I think what I talked earlier was maybe closer to the evangelist. So where you're organically getting evangelists from your ecosystem.
Fantastic. Alex.
Yeah, I can say, I mean, similar to Pramod, I'm not sure I would be able to explain one explicit kind of difference between the two things for us. I mean, maybe it would help to explain a bit more about Startup Grind to begin with. I'm not sure how many people in the audience know what Startup Grind is, but what's different about us is that we, rather than having a community that really supports a core product, our product is our community, which is kind of slightly different. So rather than having kind of ambassadors and evangelists, sort of evangelizing a community that's built on top of something else, I would say, like the core kind of, whichever word you want to pick, evangelist was the word I was going to go for, are essentially our chapter directors. So our community is very decentralized. We have a small HQ team of around 20 people, but we have a community of 600 chapters, similar to the CMX India chapter. We have a chapter like this that runs an event every month, for an audience of anywhere between, depending on the size of the chapter, maybe 5 all the way up to 200-300 people. Sometimes in the bigger cities like London, for example, they're run on a monthly basis, and each of those chapters is run by a director or a set of directors. Sometimes there are 2. Depending on the size of the chapter, there may also be a team of volunteers who support the director and the directors as well. So, for example, when I was volunteering at the London chapter before I started working at HQ, there were a team of about 6 or 7 volunteers supporting the 2 co-directors who were actually also kind of volunteering for the community. So there's this network, this decentralized network of people who are kind of evangelizing the community and saying, like, come and be a part of this. And the whole reason for existing, the whole reason for being of Startup Grind is really to educate, inspire, and connect entrepreneurs. So that's kind of like anyone who, I would say, like, to kind of answer your question, anyone who aligns with those values and that kind of culture becomes part of our community and becomes an ambassador in and of themselves. It's not really a formal role. I would say the evangelists are the directors who sort of go a step above and say, like, I want to, actually come and proactively and somewhat formally get involved in your community and actually, proactively set things up in my local region. So that's kind of how I would explain it.
So it's such a bang-on definition to think of it. You started off with saying, I'm not sure if I can really do the differentiation, but there you go, Alex. Absolutely, so clearly. I hope the audiences also have clarity, because these definitions also influence how you define the outcome and the goal of the program that you're creating, which brings me to the first segment of our session. Nothing that we do, can start without any goal and outcomes and impacts. So, Alex and Pramod, what is your take? How do you define, what would be critical outcomes and goals for an evangelist program? And more importantly, how do you define it? Because, one could say, hey, we're looking for organic growth, but that's a very generic term. How do you define success then for your program?
I can maybe start on that one if you want, Pramod. What's funny about Startup Grind is I think, and Pramod and I interviewed Sharat, who's just joined as head of community at Threader last week, and there's a lot of overlap here, which is really interesting. But I wasn't around when Startup Grind actually started, but my understanding of how it began is that the founder, Derek Anderson, basically wanted to bring people together who were passionate about learning about entrepreneurship. So essentially people who are peers, to learn from experts. So he said, I've got maybe a couple of experts in my network that I think I can bring along. I'll ask them questions on stage, I'll learn, but I'll also help everyone else learn, and we'll all connect because we're at the same stage. I don't necessarily think that there was a sort of long-term vision or objective of where that should go. It was, let's add value right now to the type of people that I associate with and that I want to support. And then because there was so much value being added there, a community started fairly quickly. You know, a sort of many to many community where people were all kind of sharing with each other because they were all at the same stage. And then fairly organically from that, because he focused on adding value, people started saying, hey, like what you're doing here in Silicon Valley, like I would love to do this in my city. Can I kind of take what you've built and essentially almost franchise this out? Do it in New York, do it in LA, do it in Chicago. And I think, you know, again, my understanding of how it began is that they sort of, the sort of initial core team said, we hadn't really thought about that too much, but sure, like here is the playbook of how we run it. Let's start by replicating that in these new cities. So kind of what is interesting is that there, you know, I think the objective emerged from a very kind of strong focus on adding value to a small subset of people at the very beginning. And then once they started to recognize the traction that this community was having and the potential for it to decentralize, I think that's where the strategy started to come in. And they started to say, well, actually, if we can do a chapter running the same playbook in LA and Chicago and New York, why can't we do that in other countries? And that's where they can set out and start to, you know, plan out the expansion of the network. I mean, I guess we can go into that later on, but that's kind of the approach Startup Grind took.
Pramod, when you guys decided to come up with, evangelists and ambassadors at Zomato, and while you're also, you're deeply entrenched into the community ecosystem, and when you come across various such programs, what's your take? What should be the outcome? Why should one even have an evangelist program
Yeah.
or an ambassador program?
Sure. Yeah. Now I had a bit of time to think on the difference. So I think, uh, so I think the ambassador program is a slightly more formal program to have evangelists, right? And I mean, there are certain perks associated with that, and certain outcomes that are clearly more defined in an ambassador program than on the evangelist side, right? I'll give you two examples. So at Zomato, we had a more evangelist approach to it. There was, at least like, from a user standpoint, we had designed a system within Zomato where people get recognized for good behavior, right? Which in good behavior on Zomato was that they're taking the effort and paid to write great reviews, which is helping other people discover great restaurants, right? And we wanted them to be like, recognized and inspiring others to contribute more good quality reviews. So for us, the outcome was very clear. So, and usually this is like a pyramid, right? So the evangelists are a handful in every city, and then there's like a broader set of, like we have 13 levels of foodies. The ones between 10 to 13 would be maybe like 1% of the users, and then like, you have the rest of them, which is like a pyramid of sorts. And it's important to get that top 1%, like, nurture them, keep them active on the platform, right? And the outcome for us was that the active contributors on the platform are increasing overall, but it's not something that we go with as an outcome to the evangelist, right? So we don't tell them that you need to write reviews or you need to be active. It's more as a byproduct. But what we used to measure was that number of active contributors on the platform are increasing, and the quality of reviews, like the number of reviews with greater than a certain number of characters, for example, that's going high. And that all depends on how well the evangelist program is designed, like, the quality of people who we are getting on board, how active they are, right? So that's like the more informal way of, like, getting evangelists there. The more formal way, which I've seen in a couple of communities we're working with, is to clearly define, and this is more going towards the ambassador side, where you define an outcome, which is like these people are heavy users of a product, and they are recognized, and they're also helping others in the community, right? So, for example, I'm just saying Notion or Glide or any of these apps. So they identify, and I think the next section is identifying evangelists, right? So these evangelists or ambassadors are identified and they're empowered. There are certain tools and like programs that can be set, which say that the more and by nature these people are talking about the product, right? So they love what the product is helping them do, and they talk about it on social media. And the way to think of this is there could be a formal way of sharing links which are unique to them, and then tracking referrals from that link, and then giving recognition or leaderboard for the ambassadors, that these are the ambassadors who've given us the most, like, number of users or referrals, right? So I've seen the champions or like ambassador programs more catering towards that, where you sort of give them the tools, the training. You maybe give them, let's say, 12 months of access to your product, and or like different, or maybe it's swag, and recognition as an expert on the community. So and I think Notion also has a empowers them to like do community events in their respective chapters, right? So that's a more formal ambassador program where you convert evangelists into like your brand champions basically.
Sure. So I think if I have to say this in probably a few words, would be that the outcome or the goal of any such program would be one, word of mouth. Uh,
Mhm.
Not so organic if you are giving them anything for referrals, but definitely some form of growth and marketing, adding more members to the community, or probably becoming the social proof that you want to establish constantly. People who are going to sort of vouch, thumb the table and vouch for you. Uh, you know, Primarily that's it could also be content creation to a certain extent. Um, but like you guys also spoke about, the next one is how do you identify these people? At the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to do this for the brand community. So in all honesty, what are the top three signals that you think one gives out when they are potential community evangelist material members? And I'm going to sort of ask Shalini to take over the session for a few minutes. I need to step away just for a few minutes, guys. But over to you, Shalini. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Over to you, Alex and Pramod, whoever wants to go first, on what are your thoughts on how we can go about identifying community evangelists?
I think broadly for us, you know, I would say number one is kind of culture. In fact, not necessarily in order, but cultural and values alignment. Again, we are a community. We're a very kind of values-driven community where we're all about kind of helping other people, giving first, and kind of making friends, essentially, all around the context of helping people build businesses. So people who align with those values, people who attend our events and kind of take part with by sort of extolling those values, often we'll make an effort to build a relationship with them with a goal of trying to kind of integrate them into the community. A lot of people who end up being directors were people who just attended an event. And then often people who end up working for our HQ team, for example, me, people who attended an event, then became a volunteer, then became a director, and then were hired to work for the HQ team. So I think often it's, the culture and the value alignment is certainly one of the first things that we think about. An obvious one is also interest in the vision, interest in the reason that we're running our community and bringing people together. So that's like, people self-select because they come to our events knowing that it is about helping early stage startups learn how to build, grow, and scale. So I think that's obviously critical for us. And then I would say, because the directors within the startup growing community have to, it is a fairly intensive, volunteer role. People have to have a lot of love for it. It shouldn't, we often say it shouldn't take more than 20% of someone's time, but 20% of someone's time is still quite a lot of time, right? So if you're doing essentially a volunteer role, you have to really love it. So the third thing is intrinsic motivation and drive. So someone who has an intrinsic motivation and drive to support others and to build their local community. So those are the kind of three things that I would say we initially look for at Startup Grind.
Got it, Alex. Yeah,
Yes.
so we'd love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, no, I think like similar approach, but essentially like at Zomato, it would be looking at signals of who's actually adding value to the broader community, right? Which is um, so there is one way to look at, let's say, number of reviews, but it doesn't stop there, because for us it was important that you were also contributing in the recent times. So the way we had scoring so there was like, obviously a scoring mechanism for on or like, across all cities. So each city had like the foodies where they would be stacked against the 13 levels, and the scoring involved not just the quantity of reviews written, but also recency and other signals of whether the review was helpful for other users, right? So those signals sort of helped us identify that these are the like high quality set of users who are most active in helping others in the community, right? So that this is one way of like building it in design itself, like, how within the product we were able to sort of surface, here are the let's say good actors, and people who are really wearing or like aligning on the values, like, Alex was mentioning, of an ideal user of Zomato, right? Um, and I think signals to which I've seen others also use in communities, whether it's on Slack or Discord, to actually look at contributors, like people who are replying more to other members in the community, and um, willing to help and go the length to like help others, right? So they are like essentially the evangelists, who, like, if you step back from the community as well, they are the ones who will take it forward, right? So um, that's how. There's one question here. I think our ambassadors always first, and then evangelists. I just wanted to address that as well. So I think evangelist is more organic than, I mean, like ambassadors. I feel is usually there's an ambassador program that is, I mean, it's cultivated in some form. There's a more formal approach to creating ambassadors, and evangelists tend to like organically grow within the community, right? So I don't know if there's one first or the other, but yeah, I think evangelist is more organic from what I've seen in communities.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to pick your brains on, like double clicking on what you said about the signals from the community on how you identify the evangelist. How do you also separate out an active user from an evangelist? So from within the community, if you had to identify, what would be the difference between the two?
Um, yeah, I can take first. So your question is, how do you separate active user from an evangelist,
That's
right?
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so active depends on the definition. Like, active could just mean I come once in a while and, just open the website, or like, be part of the community or react to things. But that's still, it's not lurking, but it's like one level above lurking, but I'm active in the community, right? But I think evangelists truly, like I said, like if the community builder or the community team did not exist, like, are there people in the community who take it on themselves, they feel that this is their community, and then they vouch for it. They help others sort of, welcome others into the community and guide them, or help solve others problems, right? So then they are essentially showcasing the values, or like living by the values of the community, right? So versus just being an active user, I would think.
Okay.
Alex?
Yeah, so I think with Startup Grind, we have a lot of different sub communities within our kind of global community. We have these 600 chapters, 120 countries. It's very kind of expansive. So there's a lot of different things I could focus on. If I stick within the sort of chapter and chapter event community, again, it's slightly different from Threado, in that we really have members or attendees, and then the directors, who I guess for us are the evangelists or the ambassadors. They're kind of interchangeable for us. So I would say it becomes fairly clear who wants to more than just an active user fairly quickly, because we try to be a very approachable and inclusive community. So generally, each chapter director is kind of encouraging anyone who wants to get involved above and beyond just attending events to actually do that, to reach out. And so we try and make it as easy as possible for them to do that. So to answer your question, if someone is just an active user, probably they won't reach out directly. If they want to be, more than that, they'll kind of formally connect with us and try and ask, how can I get involved? Basically, how can I do more? And that doesn't necessarily have to be that they want to be a director, right? It could be, that they've heard about another sub community that we have, like, oh, you guys have a startup membership program. I have a startup. How can I be involved in that other community? And so generally people kind of, they move up the sort of evangelist curve step by step, and they can do so in different ways. But normally it's a fairly formal call to action relatively quickly that transforms someone from an active user into an evangelist or an ambassador for us.
Noted. Okay. Thank you both. Do you want to just pick maybe 2 questions that have been asked in the chat? And we could start with Arlen's question. How do you handle the awkwardness of asking people to volunteer for a non-profit company, non-profit company, right? Arlen, let me know if I was wrong about that question. So I think it's about how do you ask people to be evangelists for a non-profit community or a company?
Is that specifically to do with your community, Arlen, or is that to do with reference to?
Sorry,
for-profit.
For profit, yeah.
Right. I guess we can take that with Startup Grind. So yeah, like what is difficult about Startup Grind is that, yeah, of course, we are a community, right? And, sometimes, trying to be a for-profit community, it's almost like a sort of oxymoron in a way, because I think, honestly, like sometimes businesses can become almost extractive. If they've got a community and they're building on top of it in the wrong way, it can be too extractive and lead to sort of diminishing returns over time. Given that we don't actually have a specific product built on top of our community as of now, I mean, we have things that spin out of it, but we don't have anything necessarily that sort of runs alongside it. We don't necessarily proactively ask people, right? I think we try and make it, as this is linked to my previous answer, we try and make it very clear how you can reach out if you want to get more involved, and make it more of an opt-in thing. So rather than us necessarily going out and doing formal outreach, a lot of our stuff is actually inbound. People hear about getting involved through word of mouth or through referrals from other people in the community who have really enjoyed it and really benefited from it. And they, as a result, come and reach out to us and get involved, which is good. And a lot of the reasons that they do it is, compensation doesn't have to come in monetary form, right? And I think this is something we'll probably come on to later on as well. It can come in the form of recognition or network, or I guess perception of being a thought leader. And if you're a Startup Grind director in your city and you run a chapter, you get the opportunity for all of those things. So often people reach out by, they opt in, they activate, through one of our kind of areas of call to action. They come to us and they decide whether or not they want to get involved based on the things that they can get out of it that are non-monetary. So hopefully that makes sense to you. And we do try and make this all explicit as possible, by the way. So we do say to people, if you're in this to make money, it's not the place to come. You have to be in it for these other reasons. And we literally very explicitly break those down. And there are a lot of benefits, and we try and make sure that people get those benefits as well.
Yeah. Adding on to what Alex mentioned, I think it's the latter part, like, for example, recognition that people get. So but before that, like, it's also like the purpose of the community, right? If let's say people connecting with each other is helping them get a better experience um, um, from the community itself, then we'll see, like, people want to take the initiative to sort of rally everyone together, right? And even let's say at Zomato, when we would approach, so we had a very organic way of building the users out. It would take anywhere between 6 to 18 months to get like the city up and running like fully, and to let it run on an automated mode. But that involved like one-on-one meetings with the most active users and also foodies in the city, getting them connected in groups of like 10 or 15, and continue doing that until someone from the community sort of starts taking initiative, and they start doing these gatherings and doing pub crawls and everything, and we help enable that, right? So and people do that because they are so we're not like in every meeting we're not saying write a review on Zomato, right? So we're just like taking feedback or helping them get a great experience, and there's no expectation towards a business outcome in those interactions. We're genuinely trying to connect with them like as people who want to help them discover great places to eat, and adding value there. And I think when that happens, and you're clear about it, that there's no ulterior motive beyond that, right? So I think people organically would want to like help the cause more.
Got it. Um, so what I understand, like from both of your conversations and your experiences in the past, is there's a lot that goes on behind identifying who's the right evangelist for your brand or your community. And when you put in so much efforts to identify the evangelists, what more efforts would be needed from the community manager or the planners and to strategize out what does one do when they have been identified as an evangelist? So how do you strategize the entire program? What kind of workshops, or like what are the motivations that you have in mind and planned out for them?
I guess I can take that as well. So again, with Startup Grind, it is a fairly formal role. It doesn't have too many boundaries. Like the directors who are accepted into our essentially our evangelist program have a fairly free remit to run their local chapter how they want, but they still have to follow a certain sort of rough playbook. So for us, that requires a certain level of vetting, right? So we still actually have an application process. So once people have decided that they want to be a director of their city or a co-director of their city, if there's already someone there, they fill out an application form essentially to register their interest. And then stage 2 will be a short video kind of pitch, essentially saying, this is the reason behind my motivation. And then after that, we'll actually have a short interview as well. So there's quite a level of vetting done on the motivations, the experience, and the kind of the vision of the person who wants to get involved. And then after that, we actually do some sort of fairly formal training. So we say like these are the materials that we use in other chapters to this is the kind of best practice on how the best chapters do it. This is kind of what we recommend. And then we make sure that they get an event up, because we are an event-driven community, within 45 days. So yeah, in summary, once we've found someone who is an ideal target persona, they show us that they kind of extol those values that we talked about, they are intrinsically motivated, they've then applied, we then go through several stages of vetting, and we give them a playbook essentially that's built on best practice of how other chapters do it, and then they can kind of go off and run with it essentially.
No, we had slightly more loose, I would say, like a way to work with evangelists. Like obviously, like I mentioned, a lot of things were designed within the product itself, and each city had a community manager who would then engage with the connoisseurs, as we called it, and that would be on a regular basis. So we do events where we invite some of the highest level users and also some of the new users to sort of come together, and organically then the new users sort of interact with the connoisseurs, and then they pick things up, and like we just create the space and the environment for them to network and connect with each other, right, and provide a great experience. Again, without an outcome in mind, but just keep doing that on a consistent basis, right? And we do also empower some of these like most active users. So we do blogging workshops. So a lot of so we were like a social network around food or restaurants essentially at that point. So a lot of bloggers would like blog about the reviews on their website. So we did photography sessions and how to help them take better food photos, or so basically do a lot in terms of empowering them to help them get better at what they do, right? And beyond that, we didn't go very granular on what they should be doing as evangelists. We just let them be, but I think it was more about helping them be better at what they do, right? So that's the approach that we take.
Right. Um, yeah, so around like whatever you mentioned, it's a very well chalked out plan that you both have mentioned from your experiences. I have a very naive question here, which is how long should you engage with an evangelist? Um, is there a trigger where you decide you should not continue with that person as an evangelist, or is it more like a goal based tracking?
So
I
ours
can
being, do you
go
want to
ahead.
go for it?
No, I can take from an example, like, so with every program, there's always a S curve, I would say, like in the sense that there is a point beyond which it stops being, the incremental value is like, it diminishes. And I think in the past, what I've seen is there are certain bad actors who emerge from this, right? And it's important to have control, or at least have some guardrails so that you're able to control that behavior, or stop the bad behavior. In our case, it would be like, well, these connoisseurs would go to restaurants and then start like basically saying that if you don't get a freebie, then we'll rate it as lower than 3 or something like that, right? So um, I think that's the extreme end of this design, which we need to be mindful of. So having checks and balances where we're able to identify this behavior and doing the right thing rather than encouraging that behavior is super important. So that's when I would say that your evangelist program needs to have those checks and balances so that it's not going out of control, because it harms, at least in our case, it's a marketplace, so it will harm the other side of the marketplace when that happens.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so I think ours being again, a more formal community leadership role. Obviously, people have gone to fairly great lengths to get into that role in the first place. So often, it's not really in their interest to go through all that effort. There's a lot of activation energy that required there to get into the role and then not perform. So often a lot of our directors are pretty proactive, which is good. And I think that's why that barrier to entry is helpful for us and it's helpful for them, because it weeds out people who essentially realize halfway through that they maybe don't have the time for it, right? But also, we still want to track it. There is still a spectrum of quality and engagement within the active director base. So we do have kind of expectations and requirements on our website, and often it's a director agreement that they sign. So we have 3 different types of chapters basically. So we have, similar to TED, I don't know if you know the technology education design structure, but essentially we have Startup Grind Classic, Startup Grind X, and Startup Grind SGU. So SGU is a university chapter. SGX is a sort of small town or city with fewer than 300,000 people, and the Startup Grind Classic is anything larger than that. They basically all have different levels of expectations, and we're quite explicit about that on the website. So before someone applies, they can see, and I've just got it up right now actually, like expected average number of attendees per event, expected number of events per year, expected number of different formats of the events. All these kinds of things are tracked by us on a monthly basis, and we have a set of community managers who work in the HQ team who actually support all the directors within their region. If they're falling behind that, so it's also a very proactively managed community of directors as well by our team. So anyone who's falling behind, we support them to go up, and anyone who's doing particularly well, we'll reward them, and we have awards and all sorts of other things that we offer. So yeah, that's sort of broadly how we structure it.
Noted. That makes total sense. In the interest of time, I would like to pick a couple of questions, and some great questions have come in around this stage from the audience. The first of that, Neha has asked, how do you incentivize ambassadors for your community, and how do you differentiate between evangelists and ambassadors for this purpose?
So again, for us with the directors, they are incentivized by the kind of, there are lots of non-monetary incentives, like the fact that they can use the Startup Grind name often to build relationships with well-known people in their city. So, for example, even myself, as soon as I had a Startup Grind email address and, a title within Startup Grind, reaching out to people who could come and speak at any events I was running became exponentially easier. So I'm already building a great network just because I'm part of this community. A lot of directors see that in their cities as well. You can piggyback on the success of the global community when you're starting the chapter in your local city, and say Startup Grind runs events with people like Reid Hoffman and Eric Schmidt and so on. Would you like to come and essentially, we consider you to be near that level or whatever, would you like to come and speak at our event? People build great relationships and a great network. And then, their perception by the people who are in their local community, the people who attend the event, is also then great. They're a thought leader, they're connected and so on. So, they're incentivized a lot through that, but also they get, free and discounted tickets to a lot of the events. They get behind the scenes access to the events. They get to meet, some of the speakers at the global conference. We pay for a lot of accommodation for these people when they come to Silicon Valley. So that's when we have our annual summit where they all get together. There then is a community within a community. So all the directors of these 600 chapters come and meet each other, and they build lifelong friendships. A lot of people who've been around since the beginning are still very good friends. We've even had directors get married to each other. So all of those things are kind of non-financial benefits of being part of a big global movement. Aside from that, there are also some financial benefits. So there's a split. Obviously, people are not in it for the money, but there is still ticketing and sponsorship that happens at local level. There's a split between the director and Startup Grind at local level, where the director gets 80% of any revenue that happens at their local chapter, which is a pretty good split, and we get 20%. And that's the same for sponsorships as well. So there's a fair amount of incentives that we try and lay out as explicitly as we can.
That's a great. I didn't. Yeah, the 80-20 split, I think, incentivizes the ambassadors to also own, or the directors to own Startup Grind in their local chapters a lot more, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, I think great insight on that. I want to pick up one more question, which is very relevant today. How do you make sure your evangelist or ambassador program is inclusive and diverse? Avni asked this question. Yeah. Do you want to address that?
Yeah. Maybe I can take from an example. So in markets this is depending on the market that we launched, Zomato. We were largely focused on India for the first few years as well, right? When we started out, and then we started expanding into international markets. Obviously, because of our network, and when we go to a new market, we tend to start with our immediate network. So most of, let's say, when we went to Dubai or London or anywhere else, like we largely see folks from our network largely get started and be the users using the platform, right? So and then I think the entire approach is not just about the evangelist program, or I think it's the complete DNA of the company that sort of has to adapt, like to make it inclusive. And one of the key things that we did was that in every market that we go, the team that launches used to be from India, but then we used to hire the local team within a span of like 6 months, right? And our role was essentially empower them to like take it forward from there, right? I think that when we switched to that, I think we clearly saw a difference in the local community sort of coming onto the platform, and you'd see users from diverse backgrounds, like, which represent the city, like, sort of coming in, rather than having a bias of, let's say, our team from going from here and only getting because our networks would be limited in a new market. It would sort of have a bias on the evangelists or ambassadors that we would be creating, right? So it wasn't just the ambassador program or doing something with that specifically, but I think the entire approach to how we were launching a city and growing it had to change. We learned that the hard way after like 6 8 months of being in Dubai and London, and thinking that what worked in India would work in those markets, right? So and then we felt that, hey, like, let's I think, like, the best people are people in that market actually building it out, and we sort of help them in whatever way possible to do that, right? And that really changed the outcomes after that.
Right. Um, so, given your experience, both of you have set up multiple chapters, identified multiple evangelists across multiple countries. For someone just starting out, how do they understand how many chapters should they begin with? How many evangelists is like the right set to begin with? And the set that you begin with, how do you start measuring uh, success of tangible and non-tangible outcomes that have come out of this evangelist program?
I would say, in terms of starting, I guess fairly short answer. I am always of the opinion that it's best to start really small and make sure you absolutely crush it with those first early users, because, as we've talked about, this whole event is about, ambassadors and evangelists are your best friends when you're trying to scale a community. Like you have to do things. Again, this comes from the event we ran last week with Sharat as well. You have to do things that don't scale at the beginning to build really close relationships and add a lot of value to your early users. And once they, you've developed that culture within the early community of making friends, giving to other people first, helping others, which is again the start of grind values. Those people then have those culture and values inbuilt within them, and they are the people who go and like recruit other people into your community, and they're going to do that with the lens that you've given them, essentially, with the culture and the values that you've kind of promoted. So I always think that you should start with whatever you think is manageable with your team. So if you think you can run 1 to 2 to 3 chapters, then you should focus on doing that. If you'd rather just start with one, just start with one and make sure it goes really, really well, and then test that playbook in a second city. And if there's sort of certain tweaks that you need to make, then make those, and then start to scale out slightly more quickly. But I think start small and start slow, nail that, and then those people will help you recruit the next set of people that start building your community.
Right. Pramod, would love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, so similar in approach, so we start small, like, so we had a playbook for every market launch, like, how we grew the community. The first phase usually is like identify the most ideal sets of members or users who would want to come into the community first, right? Because there's an alternate option is also we could just open the tap, like, do ads, get a lot of traffic, and go, but then that would not be sticky. I mean, we're not building a quality base. So we start small. If that meant, like in London, for example, we like our team, so it was about 3 or 4 of us every day meeting 3 users for the first 2 months, right? So we met about like 100, 150 users one-on-one over coffee, and had personally interacted with them with no outcomes in mind, right? So we just telling them about, hey, we're launching this, would love your feedback. You write a lot about restaurants, would love your perspective on how we should approach, and involving them in our journey of building Zomato, right? And some of them really appreciate doing that, so they become like, really passionate users of the product over time. And 6 months into it, we would be, let's say, maybe around 200, 300 users, but really high quality users. And then like you would start to see word of mouth going. So on your question on what to measure, I think we would not do ads until this point at all. Like, there's no inorganic growth. We try to like grow traffic with all organic means, and that really means that get the word of mouth going, right? So with the product and also outside of it, so create experiences for these people so that they and without an expectation, but they would then talk about it, and then more people discover Zomato, and that's how it grow. And we measure that by the number of active contributors growing every week, basically. That's how we used to measure it.
And it's the same at Community Hacked, right? So Pramod and I also both are co-creators at Community Hacked, and I think, obviously we both have a lot on outside of Community Hacked, so that's part of the, that's a contributing factor as well. But I do think that, intentionally we have started small with the community. We had a crossroads fairly early on where we thought, are we trying to get as many attendees as possible to these events, or are we trying to get a small number of attendees that really, really enjoy the events and are very handpicked, and we have really high quality conversations? Thank goodness we opted for the latter. And now we actually have people apply to join the event, and we vet the people who apply to attend. We know that they're high quality people, they're the right kind of persona, and that leads to really high quality conversation. And I've had many one-to-one conversations with people who have come and attended our events, and that is by definition something that doesn't scale, right? But you learn very quickly. You get a lot of very rich information about what your community should be doing when you have those conversations with early adopters. And I think that's what enables you to do the right things at the beginning. And then once you decide to sort of scale out from there, at least you know that you're scaling the right things rather than scaling the wrong things.
Noted. Yeah, makes sense. So I had one question around. So when you say metrics, active contributors, Pramod, you mentioned this for for the chapters at Zomato. When you're measuring success of the chapters, do you measure based on KPIs that you would have, like defined for the community directors or the chapter leads, or do you do that for how the micro communities are working? Because the intention of having these micro communities, essentially if it's around a brand, the goal of the outcome from the micro community would be different as compared to communities like community hacked. If they were to break out, the goals in both the cases would be different, right? So how do you measure what's the ideal outcome?
Yeah, so I think it would change depending on the kind of organization. So like obviously Zomato's context is very different from like Community Hacks context. For us, there was I mean, it's a community. At the end of the day, we took a community-led approach to growth, and for us, the growth at that point was active contributors on the platform, and every city sort of was measured on how effectively we were able to do that. So the community manager played a part of the role in sort of driving that, obviously, right? And we would look at more the inputs rather than the outputs there, right? Like how many one-on-ones did we do, or like how many events did we run, and what is the quality, or like a number of people who were the ones who were coming there. Did we engage with some of the top contributors on a regular basis? So it's more of a process there rather than from this event so many reviews came, right? So that was not the end outcome. But at a city level, we have to measure the number of active contributors growing every week, right? So there is some linkage there, but for the community manager, it's more getting into a rhythm of being in touch with the most active people, getting feedback, delighting them with small things like giving them a handwritten note. So just being very human with the people who are taking the effort to be active on the platform, right? And second order outcome is like number of active contributors increasing there, right? So I think community hack is a completely different context. But yeah, maybe Alex can talk about how we think of outcomes there.
Yeah, I think again, we've been fairly simple. I think we've taken an approach of trying to be as simple as possible with the way that we run Community Hack. Sorry. So often it's you can see in Luma, which is the platform that we use to run events, like how engaged people have been in events. You can see how many events that you've run that they've attended. So it's like repeat attendees as well. And the number of events that they sign up to where they actually attend as well. So there are things like that that are all fairly event focused. But I think you're right that certainly within Startup Grind, we also have the SG DAO, which was alluded to at the beginning a little bit. We in that sort of sub community, what a DAO is essentially it's a community driven and community owned organization. So essentially anyone who's part of that community kind of owns a stake in it. I won't go into the technical parts of it too much, but they sort of own a stake in it, and they also have a say in its future direction as well. So anything that's done happens based on a vote from the members, which is quite interesting. So for us within that community, we've actually tried to be extremely explicit in terms of the things that we want members who are willing to go above and beyond to actually do. So we've listed out a list of kind of activities that they can do that will support the DAO. And the DAO is an accelerator. So we're trying to find companies that we can invest in and support. So all of the different things that those proactive contributors can do are focused on that. So scouting companies, vetting companies, mentoring companies, and then helping us run the community. And each of those things has a scoring system against it. So that's kind of quite a new way of tracking and measuring contributions. And what's interesting about a DAO is that you can also kind of reward people with tokens within the DAO that will enable them to have a greater amount of ownership in the community. So anyone who's really interested in incentive design, who's in this event, I would definitely suggest that you look into decentralized autonomous organizations and what is called patronage or patronage tokens, because those are really interesting ways to reward people for doing the right things within a community. So yeah, another thing I wanted to add.
Thank you. Thanks, Pramod and Alex. Neha had a couple of interesting questions too. I'll just pass on the baton to Neha to ask them, and then we move into the breakout sessions. Over to you, Neha.
Thanks, Shalini. So just a quick reminder, we actually have a bunch of more questions that we will right now ask and have a lot more discussion. I've been loving this discussion, by the way. And then we'll go into a breakout room session where we'll get to interact with each other. And then we'll come back. Please come back because we have a little giveaway. So we'll announce that towards the end of the entire session. So anyway, just moving on with the discussion. So Chika asks, which platforms do you use for customer advocacy? Any thoughts on that, each of you? I mean, do you kind of bring them together on a different platform? How do you bring them together? Because obviously I'm assuming that you'd want to kind of communicate more often with them and be reachable to them as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So while at Zomato it was done internally, right, and but I've worked with like few communities, like as Threado, one of our early customers uses this platform called PartnerStack. Um, it's partnerstack.com. So that's built for like a customer ambassador program, essentially, like, where you can give unique codes, referral
We use
links.
that as well. It's good.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that's designed for like helping you create customer ambassador or like your community ambassador programs.
It's different for us, I think. Again, like we don't really have an explicit like ambassador program where people are rewarded specifically for bringing in other directors or anything like that. We use Bevy, right? Bevy owns CMX. We use Bevy, which actually spun out of Startup Grind as a company. So Bevy was built within Startup Grind, interestingly, to manage our community. Like it was literally the product. It used to be called the Startup Grind dashboard, which is an interesting piece of trivia.
So interesting.
Yeah. I don't even know why I didn't even mention it until now, but funnily enough. So we basically have Bevy, which is like our, it's where everything is tracked. We are an event-driven community, so virtual events, in-person events, they're all tracked through Bevy. And we also use, a whole host of like no-code, low-code tools in the back end. So Zapier connects to Airtable, which helps us track things as well. And then on top of that, it's Zoom calls. We have Slack communities. We use Discord as well. We also use Threado for the SG DAO. So there's a whole host of different tools that are kind of connected in the background.
And I'm assuming that some of these tools that you're mentioning are also paid. So do you kind of even pay to kind of use them? I'm assuming there'd be some additional features. So what does the investment kind of typically looks like?
Do you mean in terms of how much do we spend on these tools?
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, quite a lot for this. I mean, I'm a massive advocate for Airtable. Like I'm a heavy power user of Airtable, all the different features, and we have so many different kind of Zapier integrations into different Airtables. So every single team within HQ has an Airtable kind of or a kind of Airtable section with lots of different bases. So we're heavy users of Airtable, heavy users of Zapier. We obviously have the full kind of Google suite as well. And then Bevy, obviously having it spun out of Startup Grind, I think we're covered there. But yeah, I do think that tracking things is incredibly important in your community, right? You need to know who's in your community, how engaged they are. You need to be able to communicate with them at scale where possible. So if you can send, emails, en masse that seem personalized, that have kind of placeholders and things like that, I do think it's important, right? Because if they want to respond, they can respond into a central inbox, and you can manage it basically like a customer support team.
Yeah.
We have a central team, like we use Help Scout at the moment. Honestly, I'm not a massive fan. I used to work at Freshworks, which is obviously an Indian SaaS, baby, essentially. I think there are better ways of doing it, but managing it like a customer success team or customer support team is also important. So we use tools like that to make sure that we know who's in our community and that they feel supported.
I think this is a separate topic of discussion, an entire session, I think, and we should do it sometime soon. But again, we cannot end this discussion without talking about how to keep improving your program, right? I think important to kind of really get a lot of feedback from your evangelists and from your ambassadors, and keep talking about how you're kind of reiterating, how you're pivoting, how you're kind of really improving your program. So do you guys do that? What are some of the ways in which you've done that, and what have been your lessons? What worked? What didn't?
Yeah. So
you go, Pramod.
sure. Now, for us, I think the way to improve it was constantly get user groups into, for us at Zomato, we just call the most active users in groups to office, and sit down with them, not just for product feedback, but in general, what are we, get their perspective on how is Zomato adding value or not adding value right now, and what are some of the problems, and not just on, because we were marketplace, we did it both on the user side and the restaurant side too, right? And I think that kept us in check, and that's the best way. At least we figured, always be have ears to the ground, keep meeting the most active users, get their feedback rather than assuming that this is what it should be like, right? And I think each of the cities had their own ways of doing this. I remember in Portugal office, the country manager there had this ritual of calling one user a week to office, getting to meet the team. So that sort of became a regular rhythm where there's one active user always coming to office and giving their perspective, getting an insight into how Zomato functions, and sort of make it feel very personal, right? So when brands go beyond their logo, I think that's when they connect with the users. So that's how we approached it.
How about you?
Yeah, for me, I am obsessive about getting feedback. I'm constantly surveying people, trying to not do it more than I should, because again, being asked to fill out surveys and respond to things is
I have a
kind
bunch
of
of
annoying when it
questions
comes too
coming
much.
your way actually right now.
Good. No, I think it's important, right?
Yeah.
There's a balance between doing fewer surveys less often, but that are longer, and the other side is maybe do more frequent surveys that are extremely short and very, very easy to answer. Certainly at Community Hacks, straight after our event, we literally just have, a smiley face spectrum. And if whatever they click on, there's one other question, like, why did you give that answer? Some of the ones that we do at Startup Grind, because they're events often, or multi-day events, we ask specific conditional drop downs, like, what did you like about this event, why, and things like that. And I think because people have either paid to be at the event, or they're on our startup program or something like that, they go a level deeper and they're willing to give us that. And once we get the feedback, we are also, maybe my team find it annoying, but I'm also very pernickety about looking at every single piece of feedback, and where we can respond to someone and say, thank you for your feedback.
Yeah.
We, as a result, have done this. Always try and do that.
Right? Communicate back with them. There are some
Sure,
wins
exactly.
that we've been able to kind of get into the table and really communicate it with them.
Yeah, and then they make sure that they fill out the next survey because they know that you're listening, they know you're reading it. So we're obsessive about analyzing the surveys and following up. Exactly. It's kind of simple, right? So that's really what I do, is try and have as many conversations with people as possible, try and get as many surveys, analyze it, and make sure we kind of diligently follow up where possible.
I would love to kind of ask so many more questions on that particular topic, actually, Alex, and maybe for some time else, I've taken that down as a topic that we should definitely think about and talk more about. But anyway, really great takeaways. I think, the theme is that you should be obviously talking to your people. You should be getting feedback. You should perhaps even get some early wins, quick wins in place, communicate those quick wins back to your community. That goes a long way in terms of engaging them for a long term. But yes, I mean, the theme is seek feedback, but do something about it as well.